Hello, everybody, and welcome to day 16 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. Today we're going to look at clearance, which this is an advanced tactic, and it's basically when you force the opponent to clear a file or a diagonal or a piece that exposes them to further threats. And this can get quite complicated. But I'm very excited to bring the positions today because they are quite concrete, leading to mate, and they'll allow you to practice your visualization as well as your calculation ability. There's nothing too murky here, but it is quite complicated. And these types of positions are perfect to look at the board and not move the pieces and move them around in your head while you figure out the solution. All right, so of course you should still use your four-part thought process or whichever thought process that you've developed for yourself, but we're going to start with this first position, this example position, and then I'm going to give you three other positions for you to calculate and practice your abilities. All right, so this first position is white to move if you want to pause the video and try to solve it yourself, but here we go. So if we start from step one, we can see that white has some threats, but his pieces are quite discoordinated. He has a bishop sitting over here that's not really doing anything except controlling this diagonal. It looks like he has threats against the white king with his knight and queen, bringing a check here, but it looks like after he checks, then the king can escape somehow. The black king could move over, possibly exposing the white king to a rook check, but of course we're threatening that rook anyway, so he doesn't have time for that. So we see that black has some threats, but we want to move on to step two once we see that there's no immediate mating threats. So in step two, for our candidate moves, we want to look for all the checks, captures, and threats. So there's a queen check here, so we want to investigate that as well as the queen moving forward and threatening mate. So there's two queen moves that we can see immediately. There's also a capture, queen takes pawn, and we should look at it, but know that our base understanding is we want to make the most forcing move. Now if we take with the pawn, then black can pretty much do anything. All right, so then there's a knight check here on h6 and a knight check here on e7. So we should look at those. So far we have four moves, five with the pawn capture, which we can use our intuition to discount, but we should still analyze it. And we can start moving on to step three at this point because there's really no other forcing moves other than the checks. Of course, knight takes rook as well, so it looks like we have 6 or 7 moves that we can quickly go through. Now, 6 or 7 moves sounds like a lot, but because it's concrete, it's actually easy to figure out what you need to do, to calculate, because it's forcing. So we'll look at the queen check first, and we'll see that it's very forcing because either the black king has to move, and then we'll checkmate, or the pawn can capture the queen. So this is where you need to go down the rabbit hole. So queen check on g5, pawn takes. So you'll visualize that the pawn has taken the queen. Then you'll need to go through the same process of figuring out which checks you have. Now you have a check with the knight on h6, so it'll look like this. Now you have knight to h6, and this knight is covering g7, and you'll have to be able to visualize that when the knight is checking on h6, he's actually covering this square, so the king only has one move. Now, this is where going through every single piece and understanding activity comes into play in your calculation. Now, you want to realize that the bishop's a long-range piece, so we can go to b2 and check the king along this diagonal. And you can see that there's no interposition because black only has a light square bishop, and his rook has to come up, leading to checkmate. So you can see our first candidate move led to checkmate. Now, normally here you'd just stop and play the move, but for our purposes, we'll go through every single move in case you didn't start with the queen, which you should because it's the most active and strongest piece. So we'll see queen here isn't the most clear cut because black has a check, and we are threatening mate, but it looks like black could bring his rook into the game, or at least he could prevent it from being captured and prevent mate on g7. So if black plays here, it's not so clear what we should do. Of course, we can take the pawn and keep capturing, but black has multiple options to check our king and to bring another attack. So we'll discount queen to h6, knight to h6. King could just simply move. Of course, we can capture, but it doesn't lead to mate. So we're going to keep our queen to g6 idea. Knight to e7, the king can just escape, and he's also threatening our knight. So we can discount that idea. And of course, queen takes pawn. Black could just simply check, and we don't really have any further threats other than the rook. And lastly, knight takes rook. Of course, it doesn't have to lead to mate. The king can capture, but we have a check here, so that's good for white. It looks like we'll have mate soon. But black still has threats that he can carry out, or he could even check here and trade queens and then capture like this. Well, that doesn't work because there would be a fork. Trade queens. And white's still winning, but it doesn't lead to mate. It's not conclusive. So we're going to keep queen to g5 check. Now we're going to do our blunder check. So we'll visualize this move, and we'll look at all the forcing moves that black has. And there's pretty much only one, which is pawn takes a queen. So then after that, we'll visualize that this diagonal is cleared, and we have knight to h6. So this is what you should be seeing in your mind. King moves over, and now we have here, and then you just want to do a double check that there's no interposition along the dark squared diagonal, and that this is a mating position, which it is, because this knight's covering here, and the bishop is hitting the king. All right, so that concludes it for this example position, and we covered everything, and we did it in a consistent and clear manner. So we're going to move on to position 1, and we'll go from there. In position 1, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so for position 1, you can see that with white to move, it's quite simple, but there's forcing options with check of the rook and the knight check. So the rook's sitting here, but unless we reroute it, we can't really take this pawn. The bishop would just take. Unless we reroute it to try to get it active, there's only two forcing moves. Either the knight check. Of course, there's a check here we should look at, but we'll quickly discount it because pawn just will take the knight. And then rook takes. So you can see that looking at forcing moves, even if you don't know a pattern, you don't really have to know a pattern, you can find all the forcing moves that lead to something concrete. It's a lot easier to do that. So with rook takes, of course, your order of calculation should be the strongest piece. And the reason for that is because the strongest piece is strong because it has the most activity, which means it controls the largest number of squares. And so it'll have a greater impact in a line. So if rook takes the bishop, which is a check, then the only move is pawn takes. So you can see the benefit is that it increases this rook's activity. Now along the 6th rank, the white rook is cutting off the king. Now this is a common mating pattern with the rook cutting off the king, and we'll checkmate with a knight or a pawn. Now we would love to have our rook here and capture this pawn, and that would be a checkmate position with the knight supporting the rook, but it doesn't look like we have a way to do that. So the only other checks are knight takes pawn. Of course, the pawn would take, and then we only have a follow-up check with pawn here, but then en passant capture will destroy it. So we can see that here we're just down a rook, and that's nothing. So we'll discount knight takes pawn. What about knight check here? Now, of course, the pawn can capture, but because the white king is covering these squares, we now have a pawn checkmate because the black king is cut off. So you can see from the initial position, we can quickly and accurately discount. This only took us about a minute and a half. And when you do it in your head, it's actually a lot faster, especially if you've practiced it. So you'll see these types of positions and you'll go, oh, okay, rook takes the bishop. I also have knight check here. And you'll just see step 2. Now, of course, I didn't really go through step 1, but you can see that there's really no threats. When you're practicing it, you should do all the steps. For me, I've done it so much that it's just automatic. I'll start with step 1 and see there's no threats and then move on to finding my move. But you should practice it every single step of the way. All right, we're going to move on to position 2. In position 2 here, it is black to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so this is quite an interesting position because there's so many different options and there's a lot of calculation, but it's actually quite clear cut and simple. So first we'll look at what white is threatening. Obviously white is threatening to take this knight, and the queen is hitting this bishop, and it looks like he also has multiple threats along this file with the queen in line with the king, and we're quite exposed. So you can see that unless we do something forcing, that white will win material, and if we play passively, such as trying to protect our bishop, thinking of only one piece, then we'll actually lose a knight. So we have to do something quite drastic. We can't move this knight without losing the bishop unless it's forcing. This is where all of your analysis of forcing variations comes into play. So we know that white has some threats. We know that we need to do something forcing. In step 2, we want to find the most forcing continuation. So we start looking at our moves. So with the queen, we don't really have anything forcing yet. With the knight, we have a check. With the rook, we have a check. And we're trying to hit the king. Now this open file, H file, can lead to a lot of things. When you have an open H file along with the king, and it looks like all his pieces are away from the king, then you actually have quite a numerical superiority there. You have the knight, the bishop cutting into the king's squares, and the rook. So basically at this point, on the king's side, there's only the bishop protecting. Now, of course, we'll analyze rook takes h2 first. The bishop or the king can take. Now, if the king takes, then we'll actually just have a checkmate along here because the bishop's cutting off these 2 squares. So that's definitely something to investigate further. But of course, bishop can take. Now, if we try to play slow and bring our queen in, it doesn't necessarily work. We still want to look for all the forcing candidates while we're analyzing a line. Now, knight takes, or knight to g3 check, the bishop can take, but it's the only option. So we want to look at it because if if he doesn't take, then either we'll win the queen, but because the bishop's cutting off and the white bishop's cutting off the escape square for white, he has to take. So if we check again, bishop takes, now we have a check. So you can see we're just going for check after check. There's only a few moves to look at. And now the computer suggests white just give away his queen, but in a real game he wouldn't do that. Now you can see that we are leaving ourselves exposed to a double check here, but our threats take precedence. White has to move his bishop back, that's the only move. And now we can look for even more forcing moves, which is queen takes bishop. And at this point, there's only one piece along the h-file, the rook, and there's only one piece that white has to interpose, which is his queen. Now this formation should become very familiar to you, because the bishop cuts off the king steps forward, and along a diagonal or rank, it's checkmate. So even though black gave away almost all of his pieces, he did it to gain access to the white king, and his numerical superiority on that part of the board led to a mate. So from this initial position, you can see that we found in step one white's threats, and we know that we have to do something very forcing, otherwise we lose. Now if you can come to this evaluation, then it makes it a lot easier to find kind of desperado moves that might look ridiculous or scary at first, but you'll realize that they're the only option in the position. Alright, moving on to position 3. In position 3 here, it is white to move, and you can pause the video now. Okay, so this is a game between Tal and Spassky, this position. Tal is white and Spassky is black. And you can see here that black is quite passive. He has 2 minor pieces and a rook, which does control an open file, but it's not really doing anything. Whereas white has 2 rooks and 2 minor pieces with the queen cutting in against the king. So essentially on the king side, he is up a rook and a minor piece. And because of this, he can sacrifice a piece or more and break through. So step 1, you can see that the queen is threatening this knight if we move a rook, but it's not a real threat. The queen's hitting the bishop, but the bishop's protected by the queen. So he doesn't really have any threats. So we can move on to step 2. We want to look for all the forcing moves. There's really no check here, so we'll start looking for captures, which there's knight takes h5. There's bishop moves forward, which is a little passive. It doesn't force black to do anything. There's also rook moves forward. So in step 2, we only found basically 3 candidates that are forcing. So we're going to look at rook to f5 first. Now the pawn can capture and the knight can take like this. The knight could take here. But that doesn't necessarily lead to anything. We just gave away a rook, and it looks like if we take here, the rook can move first. And if we take, then the queen will be protecting the king enough. So at this point, we can evaluate that rook to f5 isn't forcing enough, and it doesn't lead to a strong enough position. Now, what about knight takes h5? All right, so knight takes h5. If the pawn takes, then we actually have a stronger piece, a rook, that can come in. This looks a little more forcing, a little better. What if the queen moves forward? Well, he'll move back, but what if he moves forward? Actually, it looks like we can threaten the queen again. and he's otherwise trapped. Of course, we need to look at all the pieces. The rook can come in, but once we interpose with our bishop, the queen is actually forced to take a rook or else just lose himself for nothing. So that's good. The queen can't go to g3. Now, of course, what if the queen moves all the way back? A move back is bad because it reduces his own activity, and now we're actually left with 2 rooks and a minor piece versus the king. All these pieces are completely out of play. And this is where your understanding of activity is strengthened and comes into the evaluation of position. So at this point, we're playing with a rook up against the king. So what are the other moves that we have? Of course, we're evaluating clearance. So we want to clear a diagonal. We could bring another piece in. Now we'd have actually 2 minor pieces. So we'll play e5. You don't really want the knight to take, because then we can cut everything off and we'll be threatening mate soon. So if the pawn takes, what kind of forcing moves do we have? It looks like we'd want to bring our bishop in. So we'll play bishop to h6. Now, of course, if he takes, it brings our queen over to the king's side, further increasing our activity as well as threatening mate. And there's really no way for white to protect it other than f6, so there's going to be a trade. There's also a rook, so he's trying to bring another piece over to the king's side. But at this point, it's too late, because we can cut off the piece with d6. So again, we know that from our evaluation, we're basically up now a minor piece and a rook on the king's side. Black would love to get this rook in, but our understanding of activity knows that we need to limit that piece with d6. Now, you don't necessarily need to have calculated all the way this far. It's a lot, I know, but these types of positions are where you should really get your evaluations down. Now, the positions I presented previously are really good for visualization, but these types of positions, even if you don't visualize the entire line from the beginning, your understanding of activity will be greatly improved by studying and analyzing these types of tactical positions, which are not the most clear-cut and can get very complicated very fast. But you can see that at this point, after playing d6, that black is in a lot of trouble. So it looks like we're trying to get our queen over to h6 somehow. Now black is desperately trying to gain control of his king's side and give some space for his pieces to bring the queen in, because not only did d6 cut off the rook, but it also cut off e7 for his queen. Now we'll just trade a defender of the black king's side. Now you can see that we're a minor piece and a rook up versus the queen and the rook. So these 2 pawns have completely cut off the knight. This pawn has cut off the rook, and this bishop isn't really doing anything. So how can we break through? What forcing moves do we have? We have queen check here, and rook check. So there's 3 candidates at this point. So if we look at queen check, the king just takes, so that doesn't really lead to anything. But rook check actually does lead to something, because if the pawn takes, for example here, this rook's cutting off this diagonal, so black will have to move and he'll be mated, because this light square bishop is providing a square for the queen to checkmate. So the pawn can't even take the rook. Now, if the king moves over, then we'll actually just win the queen. And there's probably a lot of mate threats coming as well. So we can evaluate that pretty quickly. is really bad for black. Now, what if black just moves back? What can we do? We can't really take here because the queen is covering, but we can also just clear out the way for the rook. We can just move, and now we're threatening queen to h6, which will be checkmate again if he takes. Now, if he brings the queen in, then this rook is cutting off the king from having an escape square, and the queen is forced to interpose itself, and we get checkmate anyway. So we're 10 moves in at this point, but you can see from the initial position, we were able to evaluate, using our understanding of activity, different moves at different points in the calculation. Now, I know this last position is very complicated, but I would analyze this position using your 4-step thought process, even if you didn't visualize everything, and try to replay, once you already know the line, try to replay the line in your head, and that will actually help improve your visualization, because lines that you already know or games that you already know can help you work on that skill solely by itself. So you don't always need to do it in a position that you don't know. All right, so that concludes it for day 16 of 28 Days to Better Chess Tactics. We analyzed 4 total positions that were very complicated, and I gave you some positions that were good for visualization, good for calculation. If you have any comments or questions, let me know, and I'll see you in day 17. Have a good day.